Hey everyone, this is ELPHNT. This video is part 2 to my video on how to generate unlimited musical ideas in Ableton Live, where we looked at how you can use some of Live's simple MIDI tools to generate an unlimited number of musical ideas to use in your productions. In this video, I want to look at some more advanced techniques we can use to take the concepts from video 1 a little bit further. If you haven't watched video 1 yet, I'd highly recommend doing that first and then coming back to this video. Also make sure that you've downloaded the free template from video 1, as we'll be using that as our starting point. So I've got the template loaded up and I've added an instrument to my chords track. I'm going to work with the chord triggers for this video because they have the most advanced functionality, but everything we cover will apply to melodies and bass lines as well. So if I play my chord triggers, I start to get some notes. I'm going to start off with something really simple, and I had a few questions about this. Let's take a look at how you can program in your own notes to start getting a bit more control over the generated patterns. The first thing to do would be to create a new clip on one of the trigger tracks. And we can program pretty much any arbitrary note in here. If you remember from video 1, this MIDI track is sending its MIDI data to my MIDI bus, which then processes it with some of Live's MIDI effects before sending it on to my synth track. So if I trigger this clip, I start to get some chords. Now, obviously where we program this note in time is going to have an effect on how our chords are triggered. So if I maybe want more infrequent notes, say for a synth that has quite a long decay, I can just increase the length of my loop to get more infrequent notes. Now if I create a clip in my second trigger track, I can also set this to be a longer loop. And remember that I want to have this at a slightly different length to my first loop. Also, just to point out that the time divisions I adjust my loop by and how I place the notes will ultimately affect the timing of my chords. At the moment, my clip is in 16th note timing, so any chords that get triggered by this clip could fall on any arbitrary 16th note. If I only want chords to trigger on 8th notes or quarter notes, then I can set my grid accordingly and make sure that the placement of my notes and the length of my loop only falls on those divisions. So now if I turn the metronome on, you'll hear that these chords will only fall on 8th notes. And now if I program in a third trigger and also keep it to 8th notes, with a little practice, you can actually get quite good at roughly controlling the feel of the generated notes. Next, I want to look at another issue you might run into, and that's the issue of note length. You'll notice that if I record a bit of this MIDI, all of the generated notes are quite short. This works fine for this particular synth that has a long decay, but what about sounds that rely more on sustained notes? For example, let me load up Live's electric instrument, which needs long notes for the sound to sustain. You'll now hear that we just have short notes playing. Fortunately, this is pretty easy to fix. If I go into my MIDI bus track, I can drop the note length MIDI effect anywhere in the chain to start controlling the length of my generated notes. We could also go into the clips themselves and change the length of the notes, but then you have to do that for every clip. I find the note length route is a much quicker option. Another useful thing to start doing is to drop the velocity MIDI effect in the chain to start getting some control over the velocities of the notes. This works best after the chord effect so that it's affecting the velocity of each note from our chords independently. I always like to set the random control to about 15 or 20 to randomize the output velocities and get more human sounding chords. You can of course use the other controls in the velocity effect to adjust the generated velocities. So you'll see now that if I record these, I have these randomized velocities. Let's look at something a little more complex, this multi-chord rack. So in video 1, when we set up the generator, we only used one chord MIDI effect, which meant that all our generated chords would be the same chord shape. This multi-chord rack, which you'll find in the template, is responsible for creating different kinds of chord shapes to make our chords a bit more interesting. Now, this requires a little bit of knowledge about how chains work within racks, which is beyond the scope of this video. So if you're not familiar with that, I'd recommend pausing now and going to check out the live reference manual entry on chains. I'll include a direct link to the online version in the description of the video. So if you're still with me, I'll assume you're familiar with working with chains. What I'll do is disable this existing multi-chord rack, and let's build a new one. First, I'll go into Live's MIDI effects and drag in a blank MIDI effect rack. Then I'll grab a chord MIDI device and add it into the effect rack. Next, I'll open up the rack's chain list and just duplicate this chain a few times. You can have up to 128 different chains in here if you want, but for simplicity's sake, I'll just stick to 4 for now. So now we have these 4 parallel chains, each with a chord effect, and I'll go into each chain and set up different chords for each one. I'm being fairly random here, but if you know the intervals for certain chord types, you can put them in. Okay, so now we have 4 different kinds of chords, but at the moment, if I were to play this, all my chord devices are being triggered simultaneously, which gives me some not so pleasant sounding chords. So my next step is to open up my chain select zone and set each of these chains to their own range. I can do this quickly by dragging one of the chain's range selectors to the end of my chain zone, and then right-clicking and choosing Distribute Ranges Equally. Now each chain has its own range within my chain zone. I can move the chain selector around and it'll trigger each chain separately and give me different chord types. But we don't want to have to do this manually. We want it to be as automatic as possible. So there's one last step. We'll map this chain selector to a macro control. And on my MIDI bus, I'll create a new clip. Now you'll notice that my MIDI bus has its monitor set to in, so it's only going to respond to notes at its input, not to notes from the clips on the track. That's totally fine though, because we're not actually going to program any notes into this clip. Instead, what we'll do is go into the clip envelopes and make sure I've got the chain selector macro control selected. And then draw some clip automation for that control. Now, if I trigger this clip on my MIDI bus, it has no effect on the notes passing through it, but the clip envelope is now modulating my chain selector macro control. So every time a chord triggers, it has a different chord type. So what we've just created is called a dummy clip. If you're not familiar with the concept, it's where we use a bus track like we have here to apply modulation to an effect independently of the signal that passes through the bus. You can set up this sort of thing with audio effects as well to get some pretty crazy results, but that's for another time. If I want to ensure that this chord type modulation is as random as possible, I can go into my new dummy clip and just set the length of the clip to some kind of really odd timing so that it's going to be completely out of phase with my trigger clips. And remember that at the moment we only have 4 chords in here, but you can set up to 128 if you'd like. And also just remembering that all of this is passing through our scale device, so it's all being mapped to a specific key. The last thing I want to look at is how we can use follow actions to impose even more randomness on this process if we want. Again, the scope of this video doesn't cover explaining follow actions, so I'll include a link in the description to learn more about those. If you are already familiar with follow actions, you can probably guess what we're going to do next. Here, I already have quite a few different clips that have different notes, all in different positions in time and with different lengths. So this is already pretty random. But what I can do is select all of these clips, including my dummy clips, and go down to the launch box and set all of these clips to the any follow action. The any follow action means that when the clip reaches its follow action trigger, it'll trigger a random clip in its group, including itself. Whereas if I set this to other, it will trigger any clip excluding itself. I can set my follow action length to a fairly arbitrary number, as is customary by now. You could set this to be quite long, but I'll set it to fairly short, so we're not waiting all day to see the effect of this. And now if I trigger my clips, you'll notice that every so often my clips will randomly trigger any of the clips on their track. You could of course go in and set different follow action lengths for each clip, maybe even set multiple follow actions with different probabilities. But I think we've probably got enough randomization for now. As usual, our final step is to record this generation. Once we've recorded some notes, we can go in and use our loop brace to select the bits that we like. Once you've isolated a part you like, a good idea is to duplicate the clip and crop it to your new selection. That way you keep the original full recording, and you can go in and do this as many times as you want to grab different parts from it. As I mentioned earlier, all these techniques will work for melodies and basslines in pretty much the same way, except obviously the chord triggers. Just turn those off to get melodies and basslines. So that's pretty much everything I've got to share about this particular technique. Thanks so much for watching this far. I really appreciate your time. I hope that wasn't too overwhelming and that you've got some good ideas for how you can apply this in your own music making. As always, if you enjoyed the video, like, comment, share, subscribe, do all of those things, and leave your thoughts in the comments. If you want to help keep these videos coming, the best way to show your support is to head over to my website, elephnt.co.za, and purchase one of the Ableton Live packs I have available. There's also a ton of great free stuff to check out as well. Thanks so much for watching.